ADDitude team. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD experts presentation titled The ADHD Love Languages, How to Communicate Better to Solve Relationship Problems. Leading today's presentation is Melissa Orlov. Melissa is a marriage consultant. She specializes in helping couples touched by ADHD improve their relationships. She's a Harvard graduate and the author of the award-winning books, The ADHD Effect on Marriage and The Couple's Guide to Thriving with ADHD. In today's webinar, Melissa will provide advice on how to solve relationship problems that are all too familiar to couples with ADHD, problems that include emotional outbursts and poor communication during disagreements. Today's expert will share strategies about how to communicate more effectively with your partner, how to remain calm, and how to resolve conflict. We'd like to begin today's webinar by asking this poll question to our live audience. Which of the following poses the biggest challenge in your relationship? Please select your answers and comment in the text box under the video player to tell us more. You'll see the poll results when you submit your response. And while you do that, I'll point out that live participants may submit questions anytime during the live event. To download the slides, click on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. If you're interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in the email you'll receive about an hour after the live broadcast. A transcript of today's event will be made available in the coming week. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, visit ADDitude.com and search to access the slides, the webinar replay, the Certificate of Attendance option, and the webinar transcript. And if you support the work we're doing here at ADDitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit ADDitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude magazine. Sign up for the latest spring issue. It's just hitting mailboxes now. Our cover story is The ADHD Guide to Love, and it's about the many ways in which ADHD affects relationships, with advice from experts, including Melissa, about how to build enduring bonds. Also, ADDitude readers weighed in about how they solved relationship problems related to ADHD. You won't want to miss this. Other articles include a report on brain training, is it worth the cost? And a new meta-analysis of studies showed no correlation between ADHD medication and cardiovascular risk in people at any age, even older adults. Subscribe to ADDitude magazine today for your family or to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Finally, the sponsor of this webinar is Inflow. Inflow is the #1 app to help you manage your ADHD. Developed by leading clinicians, Inflow is a science-based self-help program based on the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy. Join Inflow today to better understand and manage your ADHD. Click the link on screen to learn more. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Melissa Orlov. Thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this discussion.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And before we came on air, we were talking about emotional issues in communication. What I'm going to be talking about today is some specific strategies that you can use to communicate better. But in the Q&A, we will certainly address the emotional issues as well. So I want to start out really just with this basic idea, which is that you will have differences. And for those of you who are in relationships that are one non-ADHD partner and one ADHD partner, you have a lot of differences that are physiologically based, as well as family of origin and backgrounds and experiences, and et cetera. So good relationships are really about knowing how to manage your differences. And I am not assuming that all of you are married. In fact, just the opposite. I happen to use the word marriage in my work a lot, but it is for everybody. So So today I'm going to talk about 4 different specific techniques that I teach couples that help with communication, introduce you to those, show you how to set them up or what they look like, and why they help. And then I hope we'll have a lively Q&A. The first one I want to talk about is setting up a verbal cue. And first, so what I will do is I will talk about how to set it up and what it is, and then I'll give you some examples that will help illuminate how you can use them to communicate better. So setting up a verbal cue has very specific steps, and these are steps that you take when you're calm and together, not in the middle of an argument or something. And the power of a verbal cue is that the two of you have agreed that there is an issue that you would like to address. This is typically a repetitive interaction that is not positive for the two of you. And you agree not only that it needs to be addressed, but also how to address it. So the very first step to setting up the verbal cue is agreeing to what the issue is. So for example, you might have a lot of fights and you escalate quickly into those fights. And you don't want to do that anymore. So you'd like to be able to stop that before you escalate. And so that would be the issue that would need to be addressed. We have too many fights and we'd like to stop them sooner. So you agree to what the issue is. You both agree. You cannot impose a verbal cue on somebody because they are by definition about both of you participating. Then you decide what the words of the cue will be and what they mean. So sometimes you might have a single word that stands for a bigger idea, or you might have a phrase. You talk about who might use this cue and in what situations to make sure that it is actually addressing the needs that you have. And then very importantly, you talk about what each partner's response is going to be to that cue. And I'll give you an example of one as I set it up here as I go through this. But part of this is just determining how you might return to the topic in the future. It's important to understand that particularly for non-ADHD partners, it's important to have a return to the topic, some future way to get back to the topic, because there's a great deal of anxiety about whether or not you will get back to a topic if you stop the conversation. So if you don't include this step, what happens is lots of times the non-ADHD or more anxious partner doesn't want to stop the conversation in this situation, and the cue doesn't work. So you try the cue and then you figure out if it works or not. So let me give you an example of how to set one up. So I talked about the issue of escalation into arguments. And my ex-partner and I had this issue on his irritability. He would get like very fired up and get very agitated is a good word for it. And so we started with the cue, which was you're starting to get agitated. And that was supposed to be something that I would use, or perhaps he would use, but probably more often I would use at the point at which it became obvious that the agitation was happening. And then the response was to be that we would both stop talking and calm ourselves both down. So we tried this at one point. He got very agitated and I said, "You're becoming agitated." And he said, "No, I'm not. No, I'm not. Why are you always critiquing me?" And got very even further agitated, which was not the intention of the cue. So at that point we said, okay, that sounded like part of the regular conversation. And it did sound like a criticism coming from me. And so we changed it to a nonsense word, which was aardvark. It's not exactly a nonsense word, but it was a word that we would never use in conversation. So at the point one of us said aardvark, and either one of us could, then our response was to stop talking immediately and then try to self-calm and stay in the room and stay in the conversation together. We were able to do that typically. Some couples are not, and they have to actually move away from each other and to calm down before they return to the topic. And at that point, sometimes couples will like write a note. We're talking about X, and they leave it on a kitchen counter or something so that they know to come back to it. And it's not just one partner who has to remember it. So we tried that, and aardvark actually worked. It worked quite well. And of course, neither one of you wants to use it, but it did work. Let me give you a few other examples. One is when you're in a position where, for example, you may wish to move away from white lies, cover-ups, things that happen relatively regularly in many ADHD impacted couples, where the ADHD partner does something that embarrasses them or they wish they hadn't done, and they decide to not talk about it or to cover it up or whatever, and then it comes out, or they hear themselves sort of giving a white lie, if you want to call it that, to hide something that they're ashamed of. Is you're working to move away from lying, one cue that can be very helpful is at what I call a do-over cue, where you actually, the partner who catches themselves in a lie, or the other partner who essentially is going, that sounds like that's not quite right. The question is, may I take a do-over, or would you like a do-over? And then the response to that is to stop, to think, take a few moments to breathe, to think, and then have the person who made the statement hopefully say yes and start over again. And the response then to the honesty is, thank you so much for sharing that with me. So there's no punishment for a do-over. Rather, there is a preset agreement that the honesty will be appreciated. And that helps open up that honesty. Another was a person who had ADHD, a father of children who got, he got very energetic and somewhat aggressive when he got upset about something in the household. And he and the family members called that his barking. You know, he'd sort of go after people. Why did you do that? You need to do this, kind of a thing. And it was unpleasant for everybody. And he really did not wish to be that kind of a father. We had some conversations in our work together about, what would be remembered and how much that would stick with his children. So he agreed to create a barking stick, which was like a relay stick that he and his daughter put stickers all over, because that was kind of fun and a good way to engage his daughter. And anytime that he started to bark, his kids or anybody in the family was invited to go find the barking stick and hand it to him. And that gave the message, and also was a reminder of his agreement to that he didn't want to be this barking person. That was the reminder that, Dad, hey, you're agitated right now, and we'd really prefer it if you'd calm down. It worked extremely well, in part because it empowered the children in the family to be able to step up without having to say anything other than going and grabbing the stick and handing it to their father, or saying, hey, Dad, I think you need this, or whatever. And they knew they had his approval to do that because it was a cue. And so it worked quite well. Everybody in the family really found it very useful. The last example is one about exposing things that are internal to somebody that may be invisible. So ADHD overwhelm is one of the emotions that people with ADHD struggle with. And yet it is invisible to the other partner until such time as you are completely shut down and unable, essentially paralyzed and unable to interact, which of course stops the conversation. So if you set up a verbal cue that exposes that internal feeling before you get shut down, you can say, hey, I'm starting to feel overwhelmed. If the response to that cue is agreed upon, which is, yes, of course we can take a break, and then coming back to the topic, you're much more likely to have a positive interaction. Anytime you're trying to talk with somebody who is overwhelmed, it's a very frustrating experience, and things tend to escalate, which you don't really want to do. And they escalate simply because the other partner is getting non-response. So this is a way to short circuit that as well. So what you see here is that verbal cues can be used very creatively across a huge number of things that you're trying to do, either interruptive or stop escalation of any sort of thing. And you do that by listening to your body, right? So, okay, this is where I need to insert this before the escalation really gets going, or to help correct things that you're working on, et cetera. It's a very useful tool when you're trying to communicate with each other more safely and make your relationship better. The next tool that I want to talk about is about apologies. So we have a tendency to apologize, sometimes a lot, and yet not make good apologies, as I like to call them. So here are two examples of apologies, and this is part of a larger part of repairing. There are lots of different ways to repair. But here's an example. I'm sorry I got angry with you. I was just so frustrated that you yelled at me for forgetting to walk the dog. And so you may have made an apology about this, right? There's the I'm really sorry I did X. And then there's the but or the because clause, which ends up actually not really being an apology. It ends up being a blame statement. We do this all the time as we sort of try to justify our actions. But it's not a very effective type of repair. The other person tends to be irritated by it. And also, it doesn't really it doesn't clear the air as you think it actually sort of stirs things up a bit more. So let me show you some better examples on apologies. And the first one, I'm sorry I got angry. I was just frustrated. A different version of that might be, I'm sorry I got angry at you. I can understand your frustration that the dog peed on the floor, and I'm going to try to set an alarm to remind me to walk her tomorrow. Right. So there is an empathy with the natural frustration or the, rather than a defensive response. And also there is a suggested action that's going to come out of it, something that you learned from it and might be able to do better. And of course, this person has a reminder system in place that can be utilized so that the next action is better. And I guess the next one, I guess I keep getting angry at you because I feel as if your ADHD controls my life. And I'm sorry. Again, that's a because statement. I'm sorry about my anger. I'd love to be easier to be around. I miss the fun we used to have. Could we work with a counselor? So in that one, there's an ask again. And you don't have to have an ask to have a good apology, but you do need to eliminate the but or because for it to really be an apology that starts a repair. John Gottman has done a lot of work on repair that is, I think, quite relevant in the ADHD impacted relationships because it isn't actually how many times you fight, according to his research. It's really how you fight, i.e., do you fight fair? And also how you repair. And the repair is a really, really important part of conflict in couples. So there are many ways to repair. You might give somebody a hug if they're open for that, or hold their hand or touch them. You might say, I'm sorry, without the but or because again, that's a blame statement, not a repair statement. And by the way, you can make these good apologies with the understanding that you're in a long arc of a relationship. You don't have to solve everything right now. You can come back to it at another time with whatever the issue is around, for example, feeling as if the ADHD is too prominent or that there isn't a good system around walking the dog or whatever. You don't have to do it right now. But repairing is really, really important. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens when we start talking about apologies is the repetitive nature of ADHD can really make apologies kind of a landmine area. So something will happen. The ADHD partner does something, doesn't complete a project, or does something that isn't what everybody in the household was expecting. And the non-ADHD partner, there's a resentment and a frustration that grows with non-ADHD partners who feel helpless in the face of the repetitive nature of ADHD symptoms. They feel completely out of control lots of times. All this chaos is going on in their lives as well as their partners' lives by virtue of the fact that they are partners. And yet the non-ADHD partners are really have no control over whether that gets managed or not. So there's a lot of something happens, the partner says, I'm sorry. They totally mean it. This is not some kind of excuse. They totally mean it. But the non-ADHD partner becomes wary or cynical about that, along the lines of, I don't believe you. I think it's just an excuse. I've heard that so many times before. I think it's just words. you're just trying to appease me and move on. You don't want to actually discuss the issues. There's all sorts of accusations that can go out around apologies and repairs. And the issues are complicated here, right? And I'm just bringing this forward because, it is about having good apologies, but it is eventually also about creating more reliability for the ADHD partner, which then has a direct impact on the anxiety levels of the other partner and lessening those levels. And then you get this virtual positive cycle upwards versus the negative where things are very out of control and the ADHD is not being as well managed as it can be. So the ADHD partners in these situations, as I have observed them, and I've seen many of them, genuinely are sorry. That's not the issue. They're not lying. But they may feel may feel overwhelmed by the changes that need to be happening, or they may have not found the kind of systems for reliability, or maybe they're not actively managing their ADHD yet. Those kinds of things may be going on. One of the things that is often happening here is that the non-ADHD partner mistakes the lack of action for a lack of regret, and they are not the same things. And so as you work through trying to figure out how do we do good apologies, try to pull those things apart. It will help you be more empathetic and more sort of positive in your problem solving around the things like the dog walking or whatever it is that needs to be solved. And then on the ADHD partner side of things, if there is a regular and repetitive inconsistency or a problem that's coming up, you may want to set it as a target symptom as you think about how you are managing your ADHD. So I talked about Gottman and his repair techniques, and I want to talk more about that as the third area of communicating better with each other. These vary by couple and quite a bit, but what you're looking to do is two things. One, each of you create what he calls bids for repair. So offering an apology is a bid for repair. It's saying, okay, I would like to repair this problem that happened between us, and I'm going to try that with an apology, hopefully a good one. But there are lots of other ways to other kinds of bids that you can make. And it's really important as you're trying to keep your relationship as strong as possible that the person to whom the bid is being made accept the bid if at all possible. Again, you don't have to solve everything in that moment, but repairing is the first step to being able to work on things. So being open to those bids for repair is really important. So here are some different things that Gottman's research suggests are good and helpful repair techniques. Agreement, like, yes, I can see, let's say you're arguing over bedtime for the children. We may be arguing over the details, but we are both in agreement that our kids do need 7 hours of sleep a night, or 8 or 9, or whatever the number is that you're talking about. So finding something in the argument that you're having that is in fact an area of agreement can put you back on the same page and make you partners again. I talked about apologies. Approval is a repair technique. I really like how you did X. Yes, I know we're arguing about Y, but this thing was great, or I love what you did. And these bids for repair don't always come like right as the argument is happening. So anything that you can find that's positive. Humor is one of the more variable repair tactics. For some people, humor is great. It takes the complete sting out of everything. And for others, it's not good at all because it sounds as if you're not being serious about the situation. And sometimes, it's very situational. I remember an incident where I actually backed into my ex's car one time quite significantly. I left a very long red streak down his white car. And I was mortified that I had done it. And he was angry that I had done it. And I was angry that he was angry because I didn't do it on purpose, obviously. And in the moment, he said, wait a minute, opened up the trunk to his car and pulled out a completely wilted bunch of flowers and said, and this is just sort of typical. He said, well, I meant to give these to you, but I forgot about them. And so he hands me these flowers that are like completely wilted. And of course I cracked up because it was just this incredible ADD moment. And that was it. That totally diffused all of the tension. And we just parked our cars and dealt with it later. So sometimes it can be really effective. Assent, obviously agreeing with something, laughing about something together, as we did in that situation, even though it was not a great situation, is a repair thing. Positive physical contact. Lots of times sex does not fit into that in a moment of conflict because it's a too vulnerable position for people. But things like touching each other, or holding hands, or giving a hug, or looking each other even in the eyes, or something like that. Even smiling can be a repair bid. So all of these things are important. And these are things that the research suggests can be something that you can use really to de-escalate and try to be open. Even if you're feeling resentful, try to be open to those bids for repairs, because it will smooth things out for you. There are other repair techniques that are specific to ADHD couples, including treating ADHD symptoms. So reliability is hugely important in terms of being able to build trust and improve communication and manage the anxiety in the relationship, et cetera. Finding common ground, things that really the two of you are trying to move forward towards, et cetera. I do teach something called a learning conversation in my seminars, but that's a specific structured technique for dealing with emotional issues where you're looking not only for complete comprehension, but also some of the things that are hiding in between the lines. Validation is another area where you validate that your partner's opinion is really legitimate, and that they, even if you don't agree with it, that it is still their opinion and you respect it. So I want to talk a little bit about the idea of conflict resolution, which is something many of you are probably interested in. Some of the research suggests that actually the majority of the time we're not able to resolve the conflicts that we have, and therefore must negotiate it or sometimes create workarounds. This is in conflict with what I hear from a lot of partners, particularly non-ADHD women, which is, look, if we just understand it well enough, or if we just talk about it long enough, I'm sure we'll come to some kind of agreement, which is code words for, I'm sure my partner will agree with me. But that's actually not the way it works. So really it's about saying, okay, here's my position, here's your position. Now what are we going to do about the gap in the middle? It's that illustration I had at the beginning. So really you're looking for accepting some things that just must be accepted. And that includes, ADHD symptoms. And I tell couples, please, manage the ADHD to the optimal amount that you are capable of doing, and accept all the rest. That's sort of the bottom line. Creating workarounds for couples where it may not be a perfect thing, but it works well enough, and well enough is often a good goal. And then these repair behaviors. One of the ways to do this is through my last way of talking before I take the Q&A. And that's what's called conflict intimacy. So this is part of a model from the Relationship Institute that they call their 3 intimacies model. And the idea behind this is that there are 3 different types of personal intimacy. One is intimacy with yourself, knowing what your emotions are, being able to describe them in enough detail so that A, you can deal with them, and B, you can communicate them to another person so that they're aware of them. And on that self-intimacy, then you build between couples or partners what's called conflict intimacy, which in its best form is 2 individuals. The phrase for it is you are individuated, 2 individuals who recognize each other's individuality and who overlap in ways that they want to overlap in, but that respect the fact that they are two individuals. And it is a form of discussion that I'll talk about more in a moment. And once you have conflict intimacy, then that leads very naturally and fairly quickly to affection intimacy, which is how we think of romance. It's the intimate moments, it's verbal intimacy, it's physical intimacy, it's ways of doing things together, ways we show affection for each other, et cetera. But that there is a building process of these intimacies that helps improve communication between couples. So let me talk more about conflict intimacy specifically. And again, remember, it's built upon a base of self-intimacy. The idea of conflict intimacy is that you have open and non-hostile conversations with each other, neither attacking nor defending. This is a huge ask for couples impacted by ADHD. I view this as a fairly senior, if you want to call it, advanced thing that couples can do. But the good news is that it is something that you can practice and get better at. It is a skill set. It is not, it's not something that's just unattainable. I've seen plenty of couples get there, but they do have things that they have to straighten out first, including that reliability and the ability to accept bids for repair and start to accept that their partner's way of seeing the world is as legitimate as their own. So the idea here is that differentiation, if you are completely overlapped, if you are codependent, if you are in that parent-child dynamic that I talk about so much, for those of you who've heard me before, it's difficult to do this. Really, you need to be your own selves and strong, sort of equal or close to equal partners in terms of your status in the relationship. And the idea is that you express your own ideas and your own feelings, and not telling the other person what to do, not being in charge of the other person, but really just listening to the other person and honoring and believing that partner's opinions. Again, you get the opinions out there and you say, what do we do about the gap? Right? Because 70% of those things that you're disagreeing about are about that gap. It's not about, finding the perfect solution. It's about the fact that you are going to have a gap and that you need to negotiate that difference. So there are some basic assumptions in conflict intimacy, which is what the CI stands for. And the first one, which is the most important one, and one that I would like you to take away whether or not you ever end up trying conflict intimacy conversations, is that your partner has the right to their opinion and their logic flow. Always, 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 always. You may not like it. It may not sit well with you. There may be consequences to holding that opinion or logic flow, but that doesn't mean they don't have the right to feel it, think it, etc. And that your partner's opinion is just as legitimate and as important as your own. And that's sometimes a difficult message, particularly for the neurotypical members of couples who are backed up by the sort of societal expectations of how things should be thought about or done or whatever. But it is nonetheless a true statement that your partner's opinion is as legitimate and as important as your own. Again, you may not like it. You may decide to respond to it in a whole host of ways, but that doesn't delegitimize it. Your partner is the expert on their own opinion. You are not. Telling your partner what they should be feeling or what they're feeling is horrible or whatever is moving outside of your own boundaries and into an area that is not healthy. It is, if they have an opinion or feelings or emotions or whatever, try to figure out or try to listen as best you can to what those are. You will not be able to control your partner's opinions or actions, and very possibly won't be able to change them either. And that's a really tough nut to swallow when you're struggling in your relationships, but it's also a really important communication idea. It resets the stage for what you're talking about, right? That you're trying to creatively problem solve rather than bring your partner over to your way of thinking or vice versa. If you understand how each partner's thinking, then you can find the bridge. You can find the positives. You can find the ways that the verbal cues, you can use verbal cues to bridge some of the patterns, but you can also figure out, what are we trying to solve for here? I talked about apologies earlier. Apologies are not required in this work, but respectful consideration is. And again, earlier I said something about emotions. It can be difficult when your relationship is not calm, and that's one of the reasons why calming the emotional content of the relationship for both partners is important. You know, anger and resentment are the two that I see most regularly on the non-ADHD side of things. And emotional dysregulation of all sorts is what I see most commonly on the ADHD side of things. So ADHD partners can practice these skills and dramatically improve their relationship if you do these. I've cherry-picked these as some of the most effective communication strategies that you can use. And hopefully I've described them well enough so that you can start to experiment with them. So just some basic resources. ADDitude has a ton of webinars and articles you're probably familiar with. I do have my website, and these are two of my books. So I have a lot of information at my website for people who are specifically interested in couples and who don't find exactly what they want on ADDitude or want to add to it. So with that, I think I'm going into the Q&A.
Thank you, Melissa. So many people wrote in and said that they felt heard and that this was so helpful. So thank you. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to thank Inflow once more for sponsoring this webinar. I'd also like to share the final results from today's poll question, which was, which of the following poses the biggest challenge in your ADHD relationship? 31% said communication, 22% said emotional dysregulation, 15% said rejection sensitivity, 10% said listening skills, 7% said inequitable parenting or household duties, 6.5% said problems with intimacy, and 5% said understanding ADHD. So we have a lot of questions around emotional dysregulation. And some versions of questions. So I'll get right to it. One person says, my husband gets mean and angry with his lack of impulse control during a disagreement. Then after it's over, he's fine, and I'm left with hurt feelings. What can we do?
Yeah. So that is really, really common. I'm glad that you brought that one up. I bet you had a bunch of versions of that question. So part of what is going on, this is worth exploring further, is that there is actually a core characteristic of ADHD, which is emotional dysregulation. It is actually a symptom of ADHD. So it isn't just what's happening in the moment, or that the environment is the reason why that partner is so angry and dysregulated. It is that the environment is triggering the symptomatic behavior that is part of ADHD. And there's been a lot more work on that. A bunch of people mentioned RSD as an issue. RSD is one model of what this looks like. Another is Russ Barkley's deficient emotional self-regulation, which has to do with impulsivity and ADHD, and a couple of other models of big emotions and poor brakes, the race car brain, the bicycle brakes kinds of things. So this is actually an issue that needs to be thought about as a symptom, and that puts it's not just behavioral. And since it is a symptom, one of the things actually that is coming out in the research suggests that one way that can be effective for some good portion of people who struggle with this is to actually medicinally take a look at how to manage emotional stuff. So just as, for example, people who are depressed might be assisted with an antidepressant, so might people with ADHD who have the emotional dysregulation, and particularly the sort of anger, quick escalation stuff, be impacted by medications. And there are multiple different ways that these symptoms show up in the brain, and so therefore multiple different medications that address these. So there's antihypertensives, which is what a lot of the RSD medications are that Dodson's been doing. There are even the stimulant medications help with executive function. And then there are the non-stimulant medications, which also can help with what they call upregulating executive function, i.e. control over managing those emotions. So that's one approach to that. Another approach is, again, the verbal cues. One of the reasons that verbal cues can be so useful is because you can, if the person is willing to engage, and this is part of the issue, you can have somebody who inserts a de-escalation or a before we get escalated verbal cue to stop the escalation in the first place. But you have to be mindful of the fact that the body or either your own body or your partner's body is starting to get into that escalated stage, and insert that cue very early. So that's another way to get that going. But the hurt feelings are left. And when you have an ADHD partner who's really dysregulated, they have these now, not now time zones. If it's not right in front of them, they sort of reset. It's either in the past or the present and the future, and they're really sort of present focused, and they feel fine the next day because their anger is a short burn emotion. It goes up and then back down again. Hurt is a longer term emotion, as is resentment. It burns for a long time. So they're not in sync. And when you go back to a partner who has those explosions, it's very hard to get the recognition, the apologies, and the repairs necessary to help heal that hurt. This is one reason why repairs are so important, is you can get if you can get both partners in sync with, yes, I know you've moved on, but I know I've moved on, but I also recognize that you need more assistance. And so some kind of repair behavior that could help as well. And finally, working with a therapist to work through some of the hurts may be of assistance as well.
A similar question is, what advice can you give for those of us who know what to do, but still find ourselves having outbursts and communicating poorly? They can't stop in the moment.
Yeah. So again, I think the first thing that I would recommend there is to explore whether or not there's a physiological way to manage it with medication. Not everybody wants to do medication, but I have watched a whole lot of people address this medicinally with great success, and they're shocked when it is successful for them. You might not find one that works for you, but if you do, getting rid of that is a game changer. It's controlling the emotional dysregulation is the number one. That and the parent-child dynamic are the two top things that couples need to do to be able to stabilize and improve their relationships. So it's a big, big deal. So you can't magically bring it forward unless you decide, maybe with mindfulness training, you might be able to say, okay, let's stop. Let's see what's going on in the moment. What breaths do I need to take? How do I reset? How do I consider? I know coaches who teach a pause, a 10-second pause to consider what's my best thing. But you have to have the mindfulness to be able to know when to insert that pause. So there's sort of multiple steps there. But that's another approach.
Here's a question that a lot of people can relate to about the division of labor and household duties. How do you suggest my husband and I have a fair conversation about the division of labor, especially when many of these tasks are burdensome for the ADHD spouse?
So there are a couple different ways to do this. This is something I work on in my seminars. And what I suggest, I have in the back of my first book, The ADHD Effect on Marriage, there is actually what I call a chore score worksheet, where you work through not only what the chores are in your household and who's doing them, but also how easy they are. You rate them on how easy or hard they are for each partner, so that you can use that information to try to divvy things up. John Gottman also has a who's doing what around the household list that you can look up online. And I really recommend that couples get a baseline so they understand what all of the tasks are across their household. And they can then go from that place, which is less emotional and more logistical, which is useful. And then take a look at what can you do or not do. I also recommend a weekly coordination meeting. It is not one person assigning stuff to the others, but rather making sure you know what each partner is doing and whether or not it's getting done. And if it's not getting done, can you learn something from that non-judgmentally so that you can take that learning? Like, let's say, oh, I didn't realize there was a school teacher conference. We need to coordinate better. And so I have time to do this stuff, whatever you're learning, and put it back in there. But the conversation is, if you can take it away from the emotional, I'm feeling overwhelmed and I don't feel I can do this stuff. I fear I can't do this stuff, the resentment, all that stuff, and take it into the logistical, at least as a base, that conversation will probably go better. And it also goes better when you have meetings as the accountability tool rather than the non-ADHD partner as the person who's doing the accountability, which engenders resentment in both partners.
This person writes, my spouse has undiagnosed ADHD and severe RSD. I can never tell whether I'm being insensitive or if they're having an issue with RSD. I'm constantly waffling between thinking I'm a horrible person to thinking I'm being gaslit. Do you have suggestions for this?
Yeah, my suggestions would depend upon why that person is undiagnosed. So there's a bottom line. So first of all, couples make progress when both partners are engaged in the process of making progress. And if you have one partner who is unwilling to engage in that, the chances for progress diminish greatly. So the first issue in this relationship would be trying to get at why this person is still undiagnosed. Are they fearful? Do they need more information? Is there a power struggle going on? What? To try to figure out how to get that partner engaged. And if they just won't engage with ADHD, you don't always have to call it ADHD, but at least start talking about what the issues are. So that's one. And then could you read the second part of that question back to me just because I didn't write it down.
Yeah.
Sorry. You're probably elsewhere in your, caught you.
Yeah, I moved on. I'm constantly waffling between thinking I'm a horrible person or thinking I'm being gaslit. How can I tell whether I'm being insensitive or if they're having an issue with RSD?
Yeah. I'm not too, to be honest with you, I'm not too worried about whether you're being insensitive or not. There's a sort of a straight up bottom line, like healthy relationship interactions are respectful and you talk about yourself rather than about what your partner is doing. And what you're struggling with or what your feelings are or what you feel you need, and put that out there and then try to work from there. So I think that same thing holds for that ADHD partner. If they're having blow-ups and they're verbally beating you up, for example, that's just not a healthy interaction. It doesn't matter too much where it comes from other than it comes from them. And that it needs to be managed somehow. And that's why I said the very first step is to get that evaluation and get the person engaged with the ADHD or else engaged with the issues. So you can walk on eggshells only so far, and doing so isn't healthy at any time. And that sounds like what you're doing. So I would not worry so much about whether you're being insensitive. I would worry more about the absolute contributions that each partner is making in terms of whether they're healthy.
One person writes, how do you know when it's too late to save a relationship?
I get that question quite a bit, actually, sadly. I think I have a specific perspective on it, which is a great deal can be changed when couples understand what's going on in their relationship and the specific types of strategies that work for couples impacted by ADHD. And so if both partners are willing to engage with the work, get the evaluations, manage the ADHD, manage the parenting behaviors or whatever, there's typically a lot of progress that can be made, in fact, for couples. If you have, my philosophy is, do the best you can possibly do, each of you, and that includes learning as much about it as you can. And once you have you feel confident that you're doing the best you can do and that your partner is doing the best that he or she can do or they can do, then you have a much better picture upon which to make that decision. And the best your partner might be able to do might be nothing, at which point you know that that's the best they can do. Or it might be a whole bunch of stuff, and it just takes them a while to get engaged, like that last person. It might take a little while to get that person engaged, but once they do, big changes might happen. So I think it's put your best foot forward. Make sure you are. If you're a non-ADHD partner, that means get out of parenting, get out of codependency, set good, solid boundaries. And if you're the ADHD partner, optimize the management for the ADHD, become more reliable, be more respectful, manage your emotional dysregulation. Those are the things that typically have to happen. And then I think the last part of that is if you have a partner who simply refuses to engage, your partnership is not going to change particularly. And that's input that you need to use to consider whether or not the relationship will survive. It isn't ADHD that causes divorce. It's denial and lack of engagement that causes divorce.
Interesting you brought up reliability. We had a few questions around that. And this one is, can you talk a little bit more about reliability as a repair technique? One of my greatest struggles is the feeling that the ADD person in my life is not reliable, and I'm having a hard time with that.
So I talk sometimes about how to rebuild trust with ADHD. It's a different thing. And I am actually answering the question here, even though I'm not using the word reliable. Because one of the elements of trust is whether somebody has your back / does what they say they're going to do. That's the reliable part. And with ADHD, I think it is not fair to expect that a person with ADHD is always going to do what they say they're going to do. And so partners have to rebuild trust a different way on that dimension, which includes having open conversations around ADHD and having systems in place so that if something isn't going to happen that has a deadline to it or whatever, the other partner knows. So the ADHD becomes a much more neutral topic. That's when it's actually a repair technique. When the ADHD partners optimize their management of their ADHD, and that I talk about 3 different legs of treatment. So it's not just medications or the things that help change the brain in terms of how it functions, but behavioral strategies and interactive strategies like verbal cues and things like that. So a whole spectrum of things. But that then stabilizes the relationship. The fact that the partner with ADHD is making the effort and succeeding in many ways is repairing. It is a gift that that person is giving to their partner as well as to themselves. So there's a reliability on specific dimensions of staying in touch and staying coordinated and having non-judgmental conversations around ADHD that help rebuild trust. But there's also just the straight up knowing that your partner is engaged rather than disengaged and trying their hardest. That also helps when it talks about repair.
How do you validate an opinion that you don't agree with, especially when your partner seems to see the disagreement as invalidation? I know you talked a little bit about this. Yeah,
that's a good question. So I can hate something that my partner believes, but acknowledging their right to believe it is a form of validation. And sometimes, you know, like a topic, let's say environment in the news or something like this, where you have complete disagreement over what's going on, who's the expert, whatever. You can sometimes say, look, I totally respect your right to take that, you know, that stance, and I hope you'll respect mine. This is such a painful topic for me that I really can't talk to you about it. That might be the workaround for having those divergent attitudes. Or the partner says to you, I know I have ADHD, or I suspect I do, but I don't want to go get an evaluation. I'm never going to actually do anything about it. Love me as I am. And I hear that sometimes. That's a point of view. And that person has every right to hold that point of view. And you have every right to respond to it in a way that helps you live your life the way you wish to. Might be okay. You might say, okay, you're sort of an absent-minded professor, and I enjoy that, and that's just part of who you are, and that's great. Or you might say, yeah, no, actually, the way that you're bringing yourself forward, you're angry at me a lot. You verbally beat me up a lot. There's a ton of discord or whatever. And if you wish to be that way, that's fine. That's your right. I can't live with it. So you might set up a whole bunch of boundaries that delineate what you do want to live with or don't want to live with. And maybe someday you say, you know what, I think we need to be separated here for a while and see if this is really ever going to work. So it isn't a matter of coming to agreement. It's a matter of recognizing and accepting that your partner has an attitude that they are, that they have, and then seeing what you do with it. And sometimes what you might choose to do might be say, hey, I'd really like to see if I can convince you to think differently about this. Let's talk about it some more. But again, even that is a recognition of their right to hold it. You're not saying you're wrong. You're saying you have a right to hold that, but I'd really love to talk with you about it and see if I can shift your feelings about it a little bit. Like, for example, I shouldn't have to do any housework. Yeah, maybe that's not going to work in a relationship. Let me talk to you about why I'm feeling overwhelmed with this, how much there is to do, etc.
This person writes, my husband has a diagnosis for Asperger's. I feel like we are totally struggling with his non-emotive behavior and my overly sensitive emotional needs. Do you have any tips for us?
So I have to say I am not an expert in Asperger's. And so that's a difficult question for me to answer. So I'm gonna pass on answering that one. I'm sorry, but.
Okay. My husband and I have been married for 25 years, and during that time I was diagnosed with ADHD. I've made a ton of improvements to manage it. However, when we fight, he still brings up the old ADHD behaviors. He says I'm disorganized, spacey, forgetful. How can I get him to see it and acknowledge the changes that I've made?
I think there are a couple of different things. So probably the old behaviors and the things that there are reasons that those are hanging on. It probably has to do with hurt. Lots of times it's around not being seen or feeling lonely. For non-ADHD partners, feeling lonely, feeling, some kind of lingering hurt. Somebody earlier talked about anger and then talked about lingering hurt. And so probably makes sense along the lines of validating your partner's experience is to understand that for your partner, these issues are very real. Maybe it's just around anxiety. I see a lot of non-ADHD partners who are really anxious that even if things have changed, that if they admit that they have changed, that the ADHD partner will go on vacation. They'll sort of stop working on it and go back to the way things are. I see that a lot. So figuring out why your partner is hanging on to this so much would be useful. That's a way of validating their opinions. But then also asking that they hear you as well. You might have, out of 10 things, you might have done 2 accurately before, and now you're doing 8. And you want your partner to notice those 8 and not just focus in on the remaining 2. So there's probably anxiety at work. There's probably hurt at work. If you work with a therapist, you could bring up, how do we unearth some of this stuff to talk about it? And there's hurt on your side too. You've done all this work and your partner's not seeing it. And that doesn't feel very rewarding, which is a motivator for people who have ADHD, and one that shouldn't be ignored. I don't know if that helps or not, but.
That is very helpful. And then finally, our last question is, my husband shuts down during arguments and I can't relate to him. How could I get him to be more responsive?
Yeah, that's a self-defensive mechanism. So the way to get him to be more responsive, there are a couple different ways. So let me list a few. One is to actually work on emotional issues, try to drop into a structured conversation like the learning conversations that I talk about, where It slows down the conversation, takes some of the emotion out of it. If you can do that early enough, you might be able to make that conversation actually productive rather than shutting down. Lots of times when people shut down, it's because they're feeling a lot of shame. With ADHD partners carry a great deal of shame from childhood and the critiques that they got in childhood. So there could be two things going on in that scenario. One is that the ADHD partner would be well served to start to do some therapy around that shame and start to address some of those feelings. And the person who is the speaker here would be well served to be aware of the fact that shame is easily triggered and may shut down the partner and try really hard to talk about things from the I perspective, things about yourself, not about the other person and what the other person did. Anything that sounds critical is something that many partners with ADHD really struggle with. And, so that's, it's really helpful to be able to not come from a place where you might be inadvertently or overtly even shaming that partner. So a quiet approach. Sometimes the shutdown is just straight up overwhelm, in which case using that verbal cue that I talked about is very useful.
Well, unfortunately, that has to be our last question because we're out of time. But thank you so much for joining us today and for contributing your expertise to this ADHD community. Next week, our free webinar is titled Choosing the Best Summer Camps for Your ADHD Child, a Guide for Parents with Ryan Wexelblatt. We hope you can join us. Make sure you don't miss future ADDitude webinars, articles, or research updates by signing up to receive our free email newsletters at additudemag.com/newsletters. Thank you.